about my age, and he said, Congressman, it's not like it was when we were coming up. He said, there's just no jobs. Now, last year, about the time you met with us, unemployment was 7.5% in this country. Your administration and your party in Congress told us that we'd have to borrow more than $700 billion to pay for a so-called stimulus bill. It was a piecemeal list of projects and boutique tax cuts, all of which we were told had to be passed, or unemployment would go to 8%, as your administration said. Well, unemployment is 10% now, as you well know, Mr. President. Here in Baltimore, it's considerably higher. Now, Republicans offered a stimulus bill at the same time. It cost half as much as the Democrat proposal in Congress, and using your economic analyst models, it would have created twice the jobs at half the cost. It essentially was across-the-board tax relief, Mr. President. Now, we know you've come to Baltimore today, and you've raised this a tax credit, which was last promoted by President Jimmy Carter. But the first question I would pose to you very respectfully, Mr. President, is would you be willing to consider embracing, in the name of little David Carter Jr. and his dad, in the name of every struggling family in this country, the kind of across-the-board tax relief that Republicans have advocated, that President Kennedy advocated, that President Reagan advocated, and that has always been the means of stimulating broad-based economic growth?
Well, there was a lot packed into that question there, Mike. First of all, let me say I already promised that I'll be writing back to that young man and his family.
Thank you.
And I appreciate you passing on the letter. Let's talk about just the jobs environment generally. You're absolutely right that when I was sworn in, the hope was that unemployment would remain around 8 or in the 8% range. That was just based on the estimates made by both conservative and liberal economists, because at that point not all the data had trickled in. We had lost 650,000 jobs in December. I'm assuming you're not faulting my policies for that. We had lost, it turns out, 700,000 jobs in January, the month I was sworn in. I'm assuming it wasn't my administration policies that accounted for that. We lost another 650,000 jobs the subsequent month, before any of my policies had gone into effect. So I'm assuming that wasn't as a consequence of our policies. That doesn't reflect the failure of the Recovery Act. The point being that what ended up happening was that the job losses from this recession proved to be much more severe in the first quarter of last year, going into the second quarter of last year, than anybody anticipated. So, I mean, I think we can score political points on the basis of the fact that we underestimated how severe the job losses were going to be. But those job losses took place before any stimulus, whether it was the ones that you guys have proposed or the ones that we proposed, could have ever taken into effect. Now, that's just the fact, Mike, and I don't think anybody would dispute that. You could not find an economist who would dispute that. Now, at the same time, as I mentioned, most economists, Republican and Democrat, liberal and conservative, would say that had it not been for the stimulus package that we passed, things would be much worse. Now, they didn't fill a 7 million hole in the number of people who are unemployed. They probably account for about 2 million. which means we still have 5 million folks in there that we've still got to deal with. That's a lot of people. The package that we put together at the beginning of the year, the truth is, should have reflected, and I believe reflected what most of you would say are common sense things. This notion that this was a radical package is just not true. A third of them were tax cuts, and they weren't, when you say they were boutique tax cuts, Mike, 95% of working Americans got tax cuts. Small businesses got tax cuts. Large businesses got help in terms of their depreciation schedules. I mean, it was a pretty conventional list of tax cuts. A third of it was stabilizing state budgets. There is not a single person in here who, had it not been for what was in the stimulus package, wouldn't be going home to more teachers laid off, more firefighters laid off, more cops laid off. A big chunk of it was unemployment insurance and COBRA, just making sure that people had some floor beneath them, and, by the way, making sure that there was enough money in their pockets that businesses had some customers. You take those two things out, that accounts for the majority of the stimulus package. Are there people in this room who think that was a bad idea? A portion of it was dealing with the AMT, right? The alternative minimum tax, not a proposal of mine. That's not a consequence of my policies, that we have a tax system where we keep on putting off a potential tax hike that is embedded in the budget that we have to fix each year. That cost about $70 billion. And then the last portion of it was infrastructure, which, as I said, a lot of you have gone to appear at ribbon cuttings for the same projects that you voted against. Now, I say all this not to relitigate the past, but it's simply to state that the component parts of the Recovery Act are consistent with what many of you say are important things to do: rebuilding our infrastructure, tax cuts for families and businesses, and making sure that we were providing states and individuals some support when the roof was caving in. And the notion that I would somehow resist doing something that cost half as much but would produce twice as many jobs, why would I resist that? I wouldn't. I mean, that's my point, is that I am not an ideologue. I'm not. It doesn't make sense if somebody could tell me you could do this cheaper and get increased results, that I wouldn't say great. The problem is I couldn't find credible economists who would back up the claims that you just made. Now, we can, here's what I know going forward, though. Right? I mean, we were talking about the past. We can talk about this going forward. I have looked at every idea out there in terms of accelerating job growth to match the economic growth that's already taken place. The jobs credit that I'm discussing right now is one that a lot of people think would be the most cost-effective way for encouraging people to pick up their hiring. There may be other ideas that you guys have. I am happy to look at them, and I'm happy to embrace them. I suspect I will embrace some of them. Some of them I've already embraced. But the question I think we're going to have to ask ourselves is, as we move forward, are we going to be examining each of these issues based on what's good for the country, what the evidence tells us, or are we going to be trying to position ourselves so that come November, we're able to say, the other party, it's their fault? If we take the latter approach, then we're probably not going to get much agreement. If we take the former, I suspect there's going to be a lot of overlap. All right?
Mr. President, will you consider supporting across-the-board tax relief as President Kennedy did?
Okay. Here's what I'm going to do, Mike. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at what you guys are proposing. And the reason I say this, before you say okay, I think this is important to note. What you may consider across-the-board tax cuts could be, for example, greater tax cuts for people who are making $1 billion. I may not agree to a tax cut for Warren Buffett. You may be calling for a across-the-board tax cut for the banking industry right now. I may not agree to that. So, I think that we've got to look at what specific proposals you're putting forward. And this is the last point I'll make. If you're calling for just across-the-board tax cuts, and then on the other hand saying that we're somehow going to balance our budget, I'm going to want to take a look at your math and see how that works. Because the issue of deficit and debt is another area where there has been a tendency for some inconsistent statements. How's that? All right?
Thank you, Mr. President. Paul Ryan from Wisconsin.
What caught my attention in this exchange was not the fact that Mike Pence asked tough questions. The president, of course, must be prepared to face questioning. That is part of the job. But the more important point lies in how everything unfolded after those questions were asked. Pence entered the debate with an argument that conservatives had repeated for years. They argued that the economic stimulus package had failed because the unemployment rate rose higher than the initial projections made when the recession began. At first glance, that may sound like a serious criticism. But Obama immediately brought the conversation back to the part that many people often deliberately leave out. When he entered the White House, the economy was not merely struggling, it was in free fall. At that time, the United States was losing hundreds of thousands of jobs every month before any major policy from the new administration had even had time to take effect. Those losses had already been set in motion, right at the moment when the financial crisis erupted. This is a very important point, because there is a major difference between being the person who caused a recession and being the person who inherited an economy that was already deep in recession. Obama did not avoid criticism. He acknowledged that his administration had underestimated the severity of the economic crisis. That was a direct and reasonable admission. But immediately after that, he explained why the unemployment rate had gone far beyond the original forecasts. The reality was that the recession at the time was far worse than what economists, regardless of political affiliation, had predicted. That is completely different from saying that the Recovery Act had failed. Pence also made the argument that Republicans had a better alternative, one based on broad tax cuts. Once again, that is a policy debate that can absolutely be put on the table. But pay attention to how Obama responded. He did not say that tax cuts are always wrong or always a bad thing. Instead, he asked for evidence. He said that if someone could prove that a less expensive plan would create twice as many jobs, he would be willing to support that plan. That was a very practical response. The burden of proof cannot simply disappear just because a proposal sounds good on the campaign stage. If someone says they can spend half as much money while producing twice the economic impact, then they need to provide credible analysis to prove it. Obama emphasized this point several times. Then came the moment that I think was the strongest in the entire exchange. Obama reframed the issue around the phrase across-the-board tax cuts. That slogan sounds very appealing, because who would not want to pay less in taxes? But once you begin asking who actually benefits, the story immediately changes. Should billionaires receive the same tax reduction as middle-class families struggling to pay their bills? Should giant financial corporations continue to receive additional tax breaks right after a financial crisis? These are not questions being raised merely as a distraction. They are very real policy questions, because they determine who actually benefits from the law. It is very easy to turn complex economic issues into a short, appealing slogan. But it is much harder to explain specifically how the numbers will work, especially when you are still claiming that you will reduce the budget deficit. That is why Obama ended by saying that he wanted to see clear numbers. And honestly, this remains one of the biggest problems in American politics to this day. Every administration promises to create growth. Every administration promises to reduce the deficit. Every administration says that its policies will eventually pay for themselves. But in the end, someone still has to show the actual math. Another thing that impressed me in this exchange was Obama's tone. Pence was clearly trying to score political points, and Obama certainly pushed back. But he always brought the discussion back to evidence and policy, rather than turning it into a personal attack. He said multiple times that he was willing to consider Republican ideas as long as those ideas could actually prove their effectiveness. That is how a country should be governed. You should not reject an idea simply because it comes from the opposing side. What matters is whether the evidence supports that idea. Unfortunately, politics today is increasingly being driven by shocking headlines, viral sound bites, and partisan performances rather than by data, analysis, and serious evidence.